Welcome back to the Daily Rambam class. We are now in the fifth book of the Rambam. We are making some wonderful progress. We have almost covered a third of the entire work of the Rambam, which covers every section that exists within Jewish law. And the fifth book is called Sefer Kedusha, the book of holiness, which means we've covered Sefer Mada, which speaks about what every Jew must know, and some mitzvahs relating to that, and the book of love with mitzvahs relating to love, like mezuzah and tefillin, the book of times that deal with Shabbos and Yom Tov, the book of Sefer Nashim, the book of women, which deals with marriage and divorce and other scenarios. And now we're on to book number 5, Sefer Kedusha, the book of holiness, which the Rambam says is included in this section, 2 topics, and that is forbidden relations and forbidden foods. Shchita is part of forbidden foods. And why does he designate as its own book? Because the Rambam says it's with these two areas, these 2 sections of law, that we have become a holy nation, that we are special. This is what makes us holy and special. And when he begins the book, he quotes a verse from Tehillim: "Prepare my steps with your word, and do not allow my iniquity to rule over me." So we're asking Hashem, don't allow my sins to overpower me. Don't allow me to fall to the temptations of forbidden relations or forbidden foods, because it's these 2 areas that make us kadosh, that make us holy. So that was our quick overview of where we are up to in the Rambam, book number 5. In this book, there are only 3 topics. But they're quite large topics. The first topic, forbidden relations, has that no less than 22 chapters, which means it's about 3 weeks of studies. But thank God we're now up to chapter number 7, so we're a third of the way through that. And then we'll have 17 chapters that deal with forbidden foods. That obviously deals with all the laws of kosher. And then finally 14 chapters that deal with the process of shechting. So if you're ever having a discussion, or you might feel, most people would say that if you ask about the laws of how to slaughter or shechting, I'm clueless. Well, if you're coming to the Daily Rambam class, please God, there won't be a subject that you will consider yourself clueless anymore as you go through the different sections. Interestingly, as I was putting together this particular slide, I saw the total was 53 chapters, which was exactly the same as the previous book, which I just found interesting. There were 5 sections, but both books total 53 chapters, which means each book will take us approximately 8 weeks. Each of these, so this book that we're in will take us approximately 8 weeks, and we are about 1 week in, and got a couple of weeks to go. So now let's go to the laws of forbidden relations, and we are already up to chapter number 7. Now it's a long chapter. There are 24 halachas. However, if we were to just break it up onto 1 page, the first 2 halachas deal with bleeding that happens at childbirth and how that relates to a woman in the state of zivus. The next few laws deal with a woman that was in a state of zivus and then had a baby. And number 9 deals with miscarriages that follow childbirth. The next 2 halachas deal with when the woman needs to count 7 clean days and where the birth and the nidus status get in the way. And then the next half a chapter, from chapter halacha 12 all the way till 24, we deal with all different scenarios, and it actually becomes quite mathematical. Luckily, I have a couple of diagrams that I've managed to upload to the slideshow so that we can exercise our counting abilities to study Hashem's wisdom. Now, I'd like to repeat something that I've mentioned in the past in a different context, and I'll mention it again now in this context, and that is that particularly today's laws are not being learned so that a person should know what to do. I mean, firstly, because most of us are not in that particular situation, at least in the personal sense. And secondly, because actually the halacha does not follow the Rambam in this regard. There are different opinions as far as how a woman needs to count to be able to go to mikveh. And the Rambam's opinion is that a woman needs to count in cycles of 18 days, if I remember correctly. 7 days are days in which she can become a nida, and
11 days.
11 days, thank you, Steve, are the days in which she can become a ziva. This is the opinion of the Rambam, that any bleeding that a woman will experience in every cycle of 18 days, she needs to keep count. If it's during the first 7 days of the cycle, then that could give her the halachic status of a nida, and if it's in the following 11 days, it could give her the halachic status of a zava. This is the opinion of the Rambam. The halacha does not follow the Rambam. The Rambam says that the halacha says it's not set as a specific 18 days. So that's why whatever we're learning now actually is not what halacha follows. So then you might ask, what's the point in learning it if this isn't even the bottom line halacha? To which I return to a point which I've often mentioned in this class, that every halacha of the Rambam is part of the Torah, it's part of the oral Torah. So even if the halacha doesn't follow this opinion, it still is an opinion. You have a scenario, for example, where often you have the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, and they argue. And usually the halacha follows the school of Hillel. But when Mashiach comes, the halacha will follow the school of Shammai. So even if the halacha right now is only following one opinion, it does not mean that the other opinion is not also true. It just means that we don't follow it practically speaking. And similarly in these laws, although we don't follow the Rambam halachically, still it is a part of the Torah. And therefore, even if a person is studying one halacha in Rambam, if they haven't yet said it in the morning, if any of you haven't yet said it in your morning blessings, you can actually make a bracha, just like you make a bracha on food. Before, if you haven't yet done it, you can do it right now. Before we learn even one halacha in Rambam, since it is part of God's Torah, we say the bracha. If you haven't yet said it in the morning, Hashem Hashem has chosen us and He's given us His Torah. This too is part of Hashem's Torah. So we're learning this not to know what to do, but we are learning this in order to have that unique opportunity to connect with Hashem, that Hashem's wisdom becomes a part of our blood and flesh, part of who we are. So very important to bear that in mind, that in that context, these halachas are very relevant and significant because they're a part of Hashem's wisdom. And so that's the approach that we'll need to take for today's chapter. That's introduction number 1. Introduction number 2, and this is a shorter one, is that there are 2 types of ways that a woman can be required to go to the mikveh. Maybe more than 2, but we'll speak over here about 2 scenarios. The one scenario is if she is in a state of what's called nida. If she is in a state of bleeding, she's in a state of nida, she needs to go to mikveh, and then she is once again allowed to be engaged into intimacy. That's the one state that the woman can be in. The second state is not nida, but a zava. A zava is something that's, according to other opinions other than the Rambam, was more of not regular periods, but more of some kind of sickness sort, where if a woman would experience bleeding and it would be categorized as a zava, then she would also need to go to mikveh. But here, it wouldn't be enough for her to go to mikveh as soon as the bleeding stops. She would actually need to count, if this zava type bleeding took place for 1 or 2 days, she would need to count 1 clean day and only then go to mikveh. And if she had 3 consecutive days of zava bleeding, she would need to count 7 clean days before going to the mikveh. So again, if the bleeding, there are 2 categories. If the nature, and you've learned this over the last few days, if the nature of the bleeding is that of a nida, then she doesn't need to count any clean days. Rather, as soon as she concludes 7 days, after 7 days from the onset of the bleeding, even if she was bleeding the day before, she could immediately go to mikveh and can be is allowed to engage in relations. So that's niddah. Niddah requires only, it doesn't require clean days. It just requires that from the onset of the niddah, once 7 days have passed, if she's clean, she could go to mikveh and she is allowed to engage in relations. That's category number one. That's niddah. And ziva says no. You don't need to have. Well, let's talk about if she had 3 days in the status of a zava, then it wouldn't be enough for her to just count 7 days from when the bleeding started, but she would need to count 7 days from when the bleeding stopped, and only then she would be able to go to mikveh. Now, nowadays, we are not aware. We don't know which category the bleeding falls into. We don't know when a woman experiences a discharge. We don't know if it is of the nature of niddah or it is of the nature of ziva. And therefore, today, anytime a woman goes to mikveh, she needs to both ensure that 7 days have passed from the onset of the discharge, as well as experience 7 clean days from when it stops. In fact, the 7 clean days can only be counted. She can only start counting the 7 clean days after 5 days from when she last became pure. Okay, I might be making mistakes over here on the spot, but the point of the matter is that nowadays women are not sure if they're in a state of niddah or ziva. Either they're not sure or they want to be more stringent upon themselves, and therefore the accepted halacha today, which is practiced in all, at least Ashkenazi communities, is that a woman treats any discharge as both, as being a niddah and a ziva, and therefore she always needs to wait at least 7 clean days from when the discharge stops. So that's as far as the discussion of the 2 types of discharges, either that of niddah or that of ziva. With that in mind, now let's take a look at today's halachas, and there are 24 of them, so we'll do as best as we can. We'll need a bit of siyata dishmaya, help from Hashem, to be able to get through all of these halachas. Okay, so the first point that he makes, and we're now continuing the topic of a zava, which is, we said that if a woman has 3 days of zava bleeding, then she becomes a zava, and would need to count 7 clean days. And he says, the Rambam says, if a pregnant woman begins to feel pain, the labor pains take hold of her, and then there's a flow of blood before she gives birth, that bleeding is called the blood of the throes, meaning it's bleeding relating to birth, and therefore it would not be considered as ziva. It wouldn't count as towards 3 days of ziva discharge. What are the laws that govern it? If it comes during her days of niddah, it is considered as niddah bleeding and she is impure as a niddah. But if it comes in her days of ziva, then she remains pure. It doesn't count. Why? Because the Torah says when blood flows within her flesh, oral tradition teaches that it means that it's coming from herself and not because of childbirth. The above applies, provided she gives birth to a living child. If, however, she miscarries, the laws of the blood of the throes do not apply, and therefore that bleeding would be able to be contributed towards her ziva status. Even if the blood is flowing together with contractions and pain for 14 days before she gives birth. I mean, obviously from a medical perspective, that's another whole issue that would need to be addressed, but we're just looking at this as Hashem's wisdom for now, for today's class. So even if for 14 days in advance, for full 14 days in advance of the birth, any bleeding is still considered blood of the throes, and so they would still not make her impure. If, however, the bleeding begins 15 days or more before birth, once it's more than 2 weeks before the birth, then we do not associate that bleeding with the birth, and rather this bleeding can indeed make her into a ziva. The laws of ziva would apply. Now, when does the above apply? Another condition. So it has to be within 14 days, and it needs to be where it comes in immediate proximity to the birth. And the contractions, throes, and pain did not cease, but instead she continued having a difficulty until she gave birth. If, however, she discovered bleeding...
Rabbi, sorry, may I interrupt?
Yes.
When a woman reaches the stage of childbirth, even for many months, perhaps even 9 months after she conceived and before the birth, she does not have menstrual periods.
Correct. So a menstrual period is associated with nida. And that's why we said, no, we said it could count as nida.
Could only be ziva. Could only be ziva.
But he's saying over here that it doesn't count. If there is bleeding, it doesn't count to consider her a ziva either, a zava either.
No.
So basically, as long as it's associated with the birth, meaning within 2 weeks before, condition number 1, and now we see condition number 2, that it leads right up to the birth, then such blood will not make her impure. So that is in line with what you're saying. It's not of the blood that would make her impure.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
If, however, she discovered bleeding for 3 days or more during her days of ziva, amid pain, but then the pain stopped and the throes eased after 3 days, and she's able to remain comfortable for 24 hours or more, then that blood is considered a zava because it wasn't related to her birth. So again, if you're asking that there usually isn't bleeding, we're saying if there is bleeding, even during a pregnancy, if it's not associated with childbirth, then it can make her a zava. But if the bleeding was coming as a result of the birth, then the pain of the throes would not cease for that long. If she gives birth afterwards, the laws that apply to a woman who gives birth while in the state of ziva will apply, as we will see in halachas number 4 till 8. Okay. What happens if she discovers bleeding for 1 day without pain, which would contribute towards her being a zava, and then for 2 days with pain or difficulty, and then gave birth, or 2 days without pain, then 1 day with difficulty and gave birth, or 1 day with difficulty, 1 day without pain, 1 day with difficulty and gave birth, then this is all considered like this blood is considered the blood of childbirth. It does not make her a zava. If, however, she discovers bleeding for 1 day with difficulty and then 2 days without pain and then gave birth, or 2 days with difficulty and 1 day without pain and then gave birth, or discovers 1 day without pain, 1 day with difficulty and 1 day and then gives birth, then this blood is considered that of a zava, not of birth. So what's the principle? So it continues the Rambam. When there are throws in proximity to birth, then the laws that apply to a woman who gives birth while in the state of ziva do not apply to her. Meaning when it leads right up to birth, then that's that. When there is ease in proximity to birth, the laws that apply to a woman who gives birth while in the state of ziva do apply to her. So as long as there's a 24-hour gap between her bleeding and her childbirth, 24-hour gap, meaning where there's no pain involved and there isn't any childbirth-related symptoms involved, then we would say that such bleeding would be relates to zivus and not to childbirth. So those were the first 3 halachas. Now for the next 5 halachas, what happens if a woman already became entered into the state of a zava, meaning she experienced 3 days of bleeding and then she had a baby? So how does she go forward? How does she become pure? So when the 3rd day of assigning blood is the day on which she gives birth, even if the entire day is characterized by ease, as long as she ended up giving birth on that same day, then the laws that apply to a woman who gives birth while in the state of ziva do not apply to her. The rationale is that the day she gives birth is always considered as a day of difficulty. So when we spoke about a day without difficulty, we mean a day preceding the day of birth. If she discovered bleeding for 2 days and miscarried on the 3rd day, but did not identify what emerged in the miscarriage, her status is doubtful. There is a question if the laws of ziva or the laws of a woman who gave birth apply to her. Now halacha number 5. What are the laws that apply to a woman? So this actually is a mistake. This should be, no, whatever, we'll leave it for now. What are the laws that apply to a woman who gives birth while in the state of ziva? So she must abide 7 clean days because she was a zava, and we said that a woman in the state of zava always needs 7 clean days. Afterwards, she immerses herself at night and then is permitted to her husband. Only then do the laws of blood of purity apply to her. So I don't know if you remember what we learned about the laws of the blood of purity. interesting halacha. It's clearly in the Torah, but again, it's not practiced today. And that is that when a woman has a baby, then after waiting 7 days for a boy or 14 days for a girl, even if she continues to bleed, that blood is called pure blood, and so she would be allowed to go to mikveh and be intimate with her husband. So once upon a time, a woman would actually not need to count clean days at all after childbirth. She would just need to wait 7 or 14 days. Nowadays, again, the women were more accepted upon themselves to be more careful or more stringent about this, and so they do need to count 7 clean days even after childbirth. But this is what he's referring to, that what's called pure blood. Blood that comes after childbirth is considered blood that does not make a woman forbidden to her husband. So she would still need to count 7 days, not because of the blood relating to the birth, but because she was a zava, because she had bleeding before the childbirth. And then she would go to mikveh and be forbidden to her husband. She must bring an offering of a zava and the offering of a childbirth. So she should bring 2 offerings. One offering which a woman brings after childbirth, and the second which a woman brings after being in the state of zava. Accordingly, if she gives birth to a male, even if her bleeding ceases on the day she gives birth, she needs to count 7 clean days and then go to mikveh. If she gives birth to a female and counts 7 clean days, which conclude with the 14 days, she's impure because of birth or after them, she can immerse herself and she's permitted to her husband. So again, it's 7 for a boy that's born, 14 for a girl that's born. If the days of accounting conclude within the 14 days, then although she's counted 7 clean days, she will still need to wait the full 14 days after a girl, because that's a separate law that when a woman gives birth, she's impure for the first 7 days for a boy and 14 days for a girl. What is implied? He's spelling it out a little bit more. If she discovered bleeding for 3 days, then counted 7 spotless days. So a total of 10 days. There are only 10 days, and she gave birth to a girl. Means that she remains forbidden to her husband until the night of the 15th. For the entire 14 days, she is as if she is a niddah. Why do we not require a woman who gives birth while in the state of ziva to count 7 clean days after the 7 days of impurity that follow the birth of a male of the 14 days? Meaning, why don't we say first wait the full 7 or 14 days of birth and then count 7 clean days? Because the days following birth and the days of niddah in which blood is not cited are counted as part of the 7 spotless days, as will be explained. So what he's saying over here is, when we talk about 7 clean days, we mean 7 clean days of ziva discharge. And since this bleeding is not from zivus, but rather it's from childbirth, therefore it does not interfere, and so she could count her 7 clean days even while she is still within 14 days of the baby girl. Okay, now 7, a little more on this. When a woman gives birth while in the state of ziva, doesn't stop bleeding, then the laws of the blood of purity do not apply to her. Instead, any uterine bleeding is considered as the bleeding of ziva. If, however, she counted 7 clean days, completed the 14 days, and then went to mikveh, then the laws of the blood of purity do apply to her. Should she cite bleeding during the next 40 days for a boy or 80 days for a girl, then even though there's blood, it's considered pure blood, and she would be allowed to be with her husband. If she counted 7 clean days but did not go to mikveh, and then discovered bleeding, interestingly, she could go to mikveh even while she's bleeding, because again, this is pure blood. This is blood bleeding that's relating to the childbirth, as opposed to bleeding of a niddah. But until she goes to mikveh, any such blood is considered impure and would forbid her from entering into the Beis HaMikdash, or could make anybody that touches it not allowed to enter the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, now, sure, this is a little bit of a tough one. Number 9, hopefully very unpractical, but I guess in the case of twins, maybe also very unlikely, especially nowadays. Following laws apply when a woman gives birth to a female, and after the 40 days of impurity, she becomes pregnant again. So I don't know how that's medically possible today, but that's what it speaks about. She then begins to miscarry, and the blood of childbirth begins to flow with the 80 days of blood of purity, meaning from the second miscarriage. This is also considered as pure blood, although generally we do not consider bleeding which precedes miscarriage as bleeding which precedes childbirth. An exception is made in this instance. I'll explain what this means in a moment. For any blood that she cites during the days of purity is pure until she actually miscarries. When she miscarries, she becomes impure because of the birth. If the fetus she miscarries was male, she is impure as if she gave birth to a male. If the fetus she miscarries was female, she is impure as if she gave birth to a female. She counts the days of impurity and then the days of purity from the second birth. Even if she was pregnant with twins and miscarried one on one day and miscarried the other several days later, she counts days of impurity and days of purity from the second miscarriage. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on the first part because we're almost out of time. But the second point is, if a woman was to go through 2 births in close proximity or 2 miscarriages, then the count that we've learned about elsewhere of 7 days of impurity or 40 days of impurity followed by 40 days of pure blood or 80 days of pure blood would be counted from the second child or miscarriage. Okay. So here's an interesting halacha, which we touched upon already earlier. We said a woman needs 7 clean days after blood of zivus, and we're saying now that it's specifically clean from blood of zivus. So therefore, even if she has a baby or becomes a nida in between, it doesn't cancel out her 7 clean days. It doesn't reset her. Rather, she'll be able to continue counting where she's up to. I guess I'll just mention that's what he basically discusses in 10 and 11. I encourage you to read it if you're continue after the class because we're tight on time, but that's the discussion that other bloods do not cancel the count of 7 clean days. So if, for example, she counted 3 clean days and then had a baby, then after she has the baby, she would just need to count 4 more clean days. She would not need to count 7 because it doesn't reset her 7 clean days, the childbirth. In halacha 12, he says, after you have understood all the fundamental principles which we have explained, you will be able to comprehend our sage's statement that a woman may discover uterine bleeding for 114 days without becoming a zava. 140 days consecutive. Usually we say that just 3 days of bleeding already makes her a zava, but you can have 140 days and she doesn't become a zava. Why? So the first days are the last 2 days before her days of nida. So therefore it wasn't 3 consecutive days. Then she had 7 days of nida, that's 9. Then another 2 days of ziva, that's 11. And followed by another 7 days of nida, so we're up to 18. Then 14 days before birth, so that is now 18 plus 14 is 28, 38, 32. 32 days. Then the 80 days associated with childbirth. So now we're over 100. Then 7 days of nida and 2 days of ziva. So we have a total of 140 days. This one learns that any bleeding that a woman discovers after the completion of the days associated with childbirth marks the beginning of her days of nida. We do not pay attention to, okay, this is an important concept which does exist today, which is once a woman has a baby, any counting that she had previously gets reset and she starts again. So that's the general rule. There may be exceptions. Now I see it's 1:30 and quite a pity because I prepared all of these diagrams. So if you need to go, I totally understand. But if you've got another 2, 3, 4 minutes, then I'll tell you what all of these diagrams are about. Okay, now over the next halachas, from halacha 13 all the way till 24, the next 12 halachas deal with where woman bleeds in patterns. Hopefully this never actually happens in practice, but it's rather just a section of Hashem's wisdom. And the patterns will affect when she is able to reach a state of purity. So I guess the general principle is that only after she bleeds for 3 consecutive days in a status of ziva does she need to count 7 clean days. If she bleeds for 1 or 2 days in a state of ziva, then she only needs to have 1 clean day. So this first scenario, now we'll just look at the charts. Halacha number 14, I'll just do what I have charts of because we've run out of time, is where a woman bleeds one day and doesn't bleed one day. She's in such a cycle, 1 day on, 1 day off, 1 day on, 1 day off. And that's the pattern that she has. So how does this affect whether she can engage in intimacy? So during the first 7 days, so she's a niddah, she wouldn't be allowed. But immediately on that 8th day, because it's 1 day in, 1 day off, so number 8, black is when she has a discharge, and white is when she doesn't. So day number 8, she's clear, she's permitted to have relations. Day number 9, or if she has a discharge during the day, then the night of the 9th should still be allowed. But once she has a discharge on the 9th, now it's in the time of ziva, and therefore the next day will need to be kept clear. And then the night of the next day, before she has the next discharge, will be allowed, and then it'll be the cycle. Basically, for the rest of the next, till the end of the 18-day cycle, the next 11 days, she'll only be allowed to engage in intimacy every other night. If she experiences a discharge during the night and day of the second day, so it's 1 day on, 1 day off, 1 day on, 1 day off. So then it turns out that only the first day of the 11 days of ziva she'll be allowed, and the rest she won't be allowed, because every day she doesn't experience bleeding, she needs to count 1 clear day. So that's what that shin is. It's a day that she needs to keep. So out of every 80-day cycle, she's only left with 1 day. That is if it's 1 and 1. What if it's 2 days bleeding, 2 days not bleeding? So then the scenario would be the first 7 days are obviously out, but then from day 8 till 18, so that first day she's clear, but then 2 days of bleeding, then she'll need to guard 1 day, and then the next day she's clear, and 2 days of bleeding, guard 1 day, next day is clear. That's how the cycle will be. So then it would mean out of every 80-day cycle, she is permitted a total of 3 times. Okay, what if it's 4 days and 4 days? So then now 3 days of bleeding already makes her into a zava, and then she would need to count 7 clean days. So that first day, the 4th day of her non-bleeding, she's allowed. Then we have 4 days of bleeding. Then all these days she's not allowed because she needs to count 7 days. So basically, the way the cycle works is that she'll only experience a full 7 days after, I see, like 37 days. So basically, it looks like over here, the cycle is around 18. Each thing is 18. So 20, 40, 60. That's 54 days. 30, 40, 60, 80. 2, 4, 6, 8, 72. Looks like out of every 72 days, she's only allowed a total of twice. And you can figure out the calculation. But that's basically what he continues to do. What happens if it's 5 days of bleeding and 5 days of not? So now we're up to around 80 days. And then a total of 6 opportunities out of every 80 days. What happens if it's 6 days of bleeding and 6 days of not? So then it suddenly gets much better. Because since she has 6 days without bleeding, so it's easier for her to count 7 clean days. So here, out of a cycle of, I guess it's 18 and 18, 36, she's got actually 5 days. 7 and 7, she has many more opportunities. She's allowed all of these days. And then she gets another clean day, 7 clean days over here. And so she'd be allowed, but she loses it there. These days, it gets it back over here. Anyhow, you got the general idea. He goes all the way up until even 10 days and 10 days and the ramifications. And certainly when I learned this, I learned it as a part of Hashem's wisdom. And maybe one final concluding thought will be that although, yes, it's all Hashem's wisdom, and Hashem's wisdom is actually on multiple levels. So even if in practical terms it's not only talking about a physical man and woman, but these concepts probably also existed the supernal levels of male and female, maybe Zah and Malchus or Hashem and the Jewish people. All of these halachas have multiple layers and dimensions. Unfortunately, I'm not well versed enough to share with you what they mean on deeper levels, but I can guarantee you that the Rebbe wouldn't miss an opportunity in even the most abstract of laws to have a practical lesson in how we go about our life and our service of Hashem, which probably wouldn't have much to do with the physical context of these laws, but would relate in some spiritual level. I didn't have a chance to look up in my preparation if the Rebbe does give a spiritual level lesson for the service of Hashem on these laws, but it's quite possible. Thanks so much for joining and wishing you a wonderful Yom Tov.